And I came across an article in the Daily Star. I didn't know who he was. I thought it was an extraordinary piece on sustainability. I found the email address at the bottom, and I wrote to him to just express my appreciation for that piece. So it's great to finally meet in person since then, and I'd like to thank you and congratulate you for your continued leadership in the space over this period. The year 2019 was also the year when the Business Roundtable in the US, these are the top 200 companies, got together and declared that they now believe in stakeholder capitalism as opposed to the narrow focus of profit-only shareholder capitalism. They believed, they said, that they need to be mindful of their impact on the environment, on employees, and on the communities in which they operate. A few months later, the theme of Davos in January 2020 was also stakeholder capitalism. And even though there is debate on what it actually means, one thing is very clear. As entrepreneurs and as businesses, it matters how we produce things, not just what we produce at the cheapest cost. As you know, the modern journey towards sustainability started probably some 35 years ago. I think of the Rio Earth Summit that helped create the framework conventions, and then I think of the Kyoto Summit that started the journey towards carbon pricing and carbon markets. ESG became an acronym as a style of investment. And then we had the Summit of Disappointment, which is the 2009 Copenhagen Summit that is often referred to. And then we had 2015. Why was 2015 special? What happened in 2015?
Paris Agreement.
Paris Agreement. Anything else? SDGs, that's right. 2015 was the year when both the Paris Agreement and the SDGs were launched. And I was an investment banker at the time. I was in New York at the time when the SDGs were announced, and I remember it was special from my point of view because it was the first time that there was an explicit role of the private sector in the achievement of both Paris and SDGs. Remember the MDGs before that, the Millennium Development Goals? That was seen as something that NGOs and governments would look at. Not a lot of involvement from the private sector. So we had, for the first time, acknowledgement that you need private sector resources, both money and expertise, to be able to achieve these goals. And so Paris started a flurry of activities between 2015 and 2020. We had Mr. Mark Carney, Goldman Sachs banker, governor of the central banks of both Canada and then England, chair a task force called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. He's as mainstream as you can get, and he ensured that this agenda became central to the corporate boardrooms from then on. And I would recommend, if you're not familiar with the TCFD reporting template, to get familiar with it, because I think it's a great way to organize how you report on your sustainability activities, but also on how your buyers are obliged to report on their sustainability activities so that you can work backwards on what we need to do. I would also recommend referencing SDGs in your annual reports. Listed companies in many parts of the world are now required to do that. And again, it's a great organizing framework and a great way to communicate between the private sector and the government. The one thing I really like about the TCFD reporting framework is that increasingly it builds in safeguards against irresponsible use of buzzwords and rhetoric on the part of companies who may say one thing and do another thing. It makes it hard, for example, for global brands to go to Davos and say, we stand for worker rights and emissions control and biodiversity, while at the same time they may be squeezing the factories in developing countries on the cost front. That arbitrage is no longer acceptable and no longer sustainable. So that is also part of the journey that we have to acknowledge. There was also a lot of asset managers who were signing up to the principles of responsible investing, PRI. I was at that time on the investment committee of the London School of Economics, and we signed up to the PRI, as did the investors, the institutional investors who invest in H&M, the minority shareholders in H&M, or those who invest in Marks and Spencer's. They've all signed up, and they all need to have line of sight to what their money is actually financing. They need to know what is the emissions under management with their money. And not just their own emissions, but also scope 3 emissions. They need to know what is the carbon footprint of the factories in which the t-shirts are made, and the carbon footprint of the factories in which the yarn and the textile is made, and the effluent that gets released into waterways, and so on and so forth. The entire value chain needs to be accounted for. So you can be a company in a developing country and have no direct exports in your product suite, but still have to be mindful of those standards if you feed a factory that then exports into these countries. So the speed of change in this space is quite rapid, and this is transition risk. Climate transition risk is a real business risk that I think we all need to be mindful of. And my recommendation is that we should not just treat it like a compliance issue, we should treat it as a proper business strategy issue, and not treat it as a compliance issue where we have to meet minimum standards, but perhaps use it as a business strategy issue where we can stand out for superior standards. Now, of course, apart from transition risks, you have physical risks.